We're going to talk about well-being. As I said, Ted is with us often. He is always a delight to be with, and when Mike Roke, our spiritual leader, asked me if I would like to do a dialogue with him on well-being, I jumped at the chance. Of course, when thought about doing well-being at the beginning, my thoughts were basically on how we handle the solitude we've had for 3 months with the COVID. And of course, recent events have brought a whole new meaning to sense of well-being, and we find that well-being is something that is different for different people. What do you think, Ted?
I totally agree, and I first of all, I want to commend you on the course change, just because it is so important right now, but it also is, it's not so much a course change, it's a course broadening, and I really think that it's not difficult to link the two things. You know, I think our own consciousness around that kind of stuff is really, really, really happening. And I also want to applaud the church itself for sort of anticipating all of the things that are happening now. And as I listen to you talk about A Course in Miracles and moving into homes and actually going back to the roots of the unity movement, you guys have been sort of prepared for this moment. And I think that spiritual well-being is going to be the next thing. You know, it's like we're going back to our roots is also going back to a universal thing, is something that's much, much bigger and broader. And of course, being an American, it encompasses a wide variety of cultures and backgrounds and histories and events. And so I think that our own personal being well, or as the Fillmores would have said, you know, our spiritual well-being is also the thing that presages, or it becomes before our physical well-being. And our physical well-being includes the health and life of all humanity and all people, not just in the face of a pandemic, but also in the face of a realization that we belong to a bigger world, and that we have history to get over, and that's part of our well-being, beyond just staying healthy, staying physically healthy. So yeah, I want to applaud you first of all, and then I also think that this topic is well worth spending the month on.
Yes, the affirmation that goes with the month is, my heart knows well-being no matter the circumstances. Boy, does that say a lot in the present situation.
Yes.
The sense of well-being is generated from within us. It's something that has to come from within. If we are generating our sense of well-being from without, it's like we can never have it. And that, of course, that's very unity also. The Fillmores always believed that you had to have it within you in order to use it or work with it. And I have a regular meditation practice that I do every day. I'm very fortunate to live in an apartment where my cat lets me stay and wait on him. And he's 13 years old and the absolute love of my life. A good kitty. I've had him for 11 years. He's a rescue. And we all find our own way of dealing with the isolation and solitude, and we all have to find our own way, hopefully, to address the problems that are present in the world.
Yes.
The problems will not go away. That approach will never work.
I think that, going back to the beginning of the Unity Church, the fascinating thing is that what prompted the existence of not necessarily a church, but a movement that was going on at the time is two things. And one of them was that after the Civil War, all kinds of great things happened. And then all of a sudden, right around the 1880s, Reconstruction ended and they went into the Jim Crow period. And so all of a sudden, when all of the different states had voting for everybody, and there were lots of black representatives and mayors and people that much more resembled the country as a whole, all of a sudden it went backwards, and Reconstruction deconstructed at that time. At the same time, there was a pandemic going on, and so if you remember that Mrs. Fillmore, I think is the actual founder of the church, that she had tuberculosis. And it wasn't but a few years before she contracted it that they realized that it was a bacteria. And a second movement started, and that was the isolation movement, what we think of as the sanitarium movement. And people were taken out of their homes and put in sanitariums. And she chose not to isolate herself and isolate herself in her home. She was the original self-quarantiner. And then she did something very, very, very interesting and also very universal, is that she changed the method of her prayer. And that's sort of the basis of how I feel right now, is that I think that typically as Westerners or as Hellenistic people or as Christians or even as pagans, that we tend to pray, I want. And well-being comes from a word that is closer to wish. And wish does not mean I want or I hope something will happen. It means I cherish something. And so when Mrs. Fillmore said, I'm a child of God, and therefore I inherit my well-being, and therefore I do not inherit sickness.
Yes, the health was her godly right.
Yes, absolutely. And that her spiritual well-being came first. And so I think that we're being given a gift right now to really, really, really look at ourselves, not just our physical health, because I think that we're all subject to what can happen to us if we go out there or if we whatever the things are we're doing. But I also think that right now we're being given an opportunity to look at our spiritual well-being, and that includes our privilege. It includes the things that are being exposed in the world, just as what she was having exposed to her at the time. I think the miracle of what happened to her when she decided to look at her own spiritual well-being is that she discovered that it was the universal methods of what you just mentioned, that you have a form of meditation, that looking into ourselves and finding the source or the Christ or the God source or whatever that is that was at the heart of what she was doing. Very different than Mary Baker Eddy or some of the other people in the similar movements. Yeah, very different. And that she found herself at the first Congress of World Religions primarily because people like Yogananda were talking about well-being in a totally different sense than the physical, the material, the corporeal sense. And I think that much of her healing and much of the preaching that they started putting out, which would have been online at the time, instead of having a church, they started mail order churches, and they were practicing in their homes.
Yes,
And so,
unity in its origin was actually not considered a religion. The Fillmores did not set out to start a religion, and it was something that people did in the afternoon or evening of Sunday in their homes. And they would bring
yes,
together a group of like-minded people, and it was a practice from their homes in
yeah,
addition to whatever religious practices they might partake of in the morning. And
yep,
the movement grew from there and did become churches. But the Fillmores themselves never foresaw the movement as being a religion. It
yeah,
was to be a spiritual movement
yeah.
and allow people to gain a sense of self and well-being and a sense of the world around them. And I think that that's very important for us to remember even to this day.
Yeah, I think that like within a few years of her her own personal realization, came the realization that the the world came to America, during the Columbian Exposition. But before that, all sorts of ideas from people of all colors and all nations came in, because there was a sort of a consciousness around um, the last 400 years, because that's what the exposition was celebrating. But not only all of the good things that happened about being in America, but also all of the bad things. And so welcoming the world back into what was a very nationalistic time was a huge, huge different thing. And also understanding that the thoughts and the beliefs and the religions and the well-being and the methods of being well of all other people was all exploding at the time. There was this sort of beautiful renaissance after this horrible period of time. And so I personally want to focus on what's going to happen with us after this. What does the
Comes
church look
next?
like? Yeah. What does the church look like? What does the well-being of each of us look like? Is actually the way it started. It's like, are each of us the church in the same way? Is that, are each of us a reflection or a piece of God or a child of God or
Absolutely.
source, or however you want to look at it? And if we start looking at ourselves, I think it's important to understand that we can't apply that to ourselves only. It's like, if I am a piece of God, then everyone is a piece of God. And the way I treat myself, the wishes that I have, or the well wishes that I have for myself, and the well-being that I have for myself, is what I then have to apply to everybody else. And I think that that's something we're learning in a very difficult way right now. But I also think it's like pulling off a Band-Aid. I think it's been a long, long time coming, and I think that hopefully, it will start moving towards us becoming able to go out, or able to be with other people, and that we do it differently. We don't go back to how we were before. And I really think that that means, like, how we attend to our communities, to our governments, to our police forces, to our, and all of the segments of our community, that even after the 60s, we are still very, very divided. That when we appreciate ourselves, and we are now starting to appreciate each other, that we start coming together in a totally different way. And that when the community square is filled in the time after this, that it's not to protest, but it's also to just begin the conversation and to begin the healing and to begin the well-being of all of us as a just not just as a community, but as a nation and also as a world. Because what's going on, I think you mentioned this earlier when we were talking, that the movements that we see going on here is not just about America.
No, in Australia, you have not Black Lives Matter, but Aborigine Lives Matter.
Yep.
And so what we're talking about really, and the way I like to put it is Black Lives Matter because all lives matter. And if we lose track of both pieces of that equation, we're going to get lost. And backing up to something you said about what happened in the Reconstruction period, I don't know if I ever told you, my major in college and my master's degree is American history. And what you're referring to is Reconstruction continued through the two terms of President Grant.
Yes.
And then there was, in 1876, there was the Hayes-Tilden election. And there were some disputed electoral votes. And a deal was struck. The Democrats would concede the votes to the Republicans if the Republicans would end Reconstruction. And it was a dirty deal.
Yeah. Yeah.
And many times it's a dirty deal.
Yeah.
Either way. And that's why I don't like getting into politics, because you can point fingers at everybody one way or another. But that was the historical context of what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and I think that, if you think about that on a local level, I think the idea that spread from house to house through a fairly new national thing, the post office, which was like the internet of its time, was that the ability to communicate directly across state lines to people changed the conversation. I think before that we were very congregational. I think that what your local pastor believed is what you believed, and now all of a sudden people were talking, and having conversations that crossed state lines, and necessarily so, because people were becoming more and more realizing that, after the Civil War, definitely, and definitely after the two terms of Hayes, that the country did not look like it did in most people's backyard, that many people, especially here in the North, really didn't have a consciousness around the idea that that there were people of different color, or even that the white people in the North were different than the white people in the South. And we started realizing our differences and becoming afraid of them. And I think that the beauty of what happened in the 1890s, into the 1900s, was a beautiful period. And then we bounced back again into the era of the Klan in the 1920s. Even here in Grand Rapids, I just posted a picture the other day of a Klan parade that had 3,000 Klan marchers in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and 12,000 members all lining the streets, going right through the Polish and Lithuanian community, on their way to the Black community. So at that time, the lives that didn't matter were the lives of poor people, were the lives of Polish Catholics and Lithuanian Catholics, and people who were being oppressed at the time. And so that parade cut right through the West Side and right into across the river and into the neighborhoods where the Black Baptist Church and the Black AME and the BME Church were. And then they marched right back up Michigan Street and camped thousands and thousands of them here in Grand Rapids, Michigan in 1925 in Jauw Park. So they camped illegally at Jauw Park and held a huge protest and a rally. And they were protesting against not just the blacks here in Grand Rapids, but against Polish and Lithuanian immigrants, and also against parochial schools. So 1925 is the year that Christian High opened up, and 1926 is the year that Catholic Central or Catholic High School opened up here. And so it was also an anti-Protestant, an anti-Catholic and an anti-Christian and an anti-Dutch Reformed movement as well.
Very reminiscent, Ted, of the Know-Nothings in the 1880s and 1890s. And the Know-Nothings were an isolationist movement within the United States. And the interesting thing is that historically, the country itself has always had an isolationist feel. It did not want to get into World War I. It finally did. It did not want to get into World War II, which we were dragged into by an attack. But the basic tendency of the country is isolationism, historically. And as the world has expanded, particularly the world of information technology, I mean, when I was growing up, I'm 75 years old, and when I was growing up, there were 3 networks, period. And,
yeah, me too.
Yep, and a couple of newspapers. There was not only the Grand Rapids Press, that came out in the evening, the Grand Rapids Herald came out in the morning. And I read both newspapers. Now the Grand Rapids Press is, I think, 3 days a week, Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday. Things have changed. The technologies have changed. We have a zillion channels to look at on television, and the old adage is 500 channels and nothing's on. And you could say that at times about the various offerings. And then you have now the entire cell phone technology, where the individual people can, with their phones, take pictures and take recordings of things that are happening. And they can do it live. And it's changed dramatically how we get our news, when we get our news, and what the slant is on the news.
Yeah. I think that it's fascinating to me, because I go way back in history, and I remember we talked about in a sermon several months ago about the idea of the Mayan and the Hopi prophecies, and that there would be a World Wide Web. Part of that prophecy, which is what they call the Tower of T, which is like our Tower of Babel story, is the idea that we once were all connected by our hearts, that we could not lie to each other because communication was not verbal. It was through our hearts, and we were connected heart to heart worldwide. And that the prophecy was that we exchanged knowledge and language for that ability, but that it would come back. And it would come back after a time that the natives in this hemisphere think of as the New World or the Fifth World, or the Mayan after the harmonic convergence, is the idea that the prophecy would be that we would start to communicate again heart to heart. But before that, the web of the world would be reconstructed so that we would be able to communicate verbally instantaneously. And that's happened with the telephone. And so now the metaphor has reversed itself. And just like we're talking about what happened at the beginning with the Unity Church during a period of time that was very similar to what we're in now, um, the period of the Tower of Tea is the period of smallpox, and and the height of the Mayan civilization that came apart, not just because of Western contact, but because before that it was overusing its resources, and the kingdoms were meeting each other, and they were becoming nationalistic, and they had wars. All of those things were predicted to happen and come again, and that when it turned around, there would be a period after that, the one that the Mayan calendar says we're going into. We're in the first 5 years of their new calendar, and they're talking about this idea that our ability to communicate with our hearts is going to be the next evolution, the next thing about who we are as human beings, or as they think of being a Mayan as a real human being, and that we're all going to become real human beings like they used to be. But part of that communicating with the heart is this idea of empathy. So we don't just sympathize with people of different colors or different nations or different, we empathize. We realize that we are like everybody else, and that, that our baseline is that all lives matter, but we have to have a realization that we have not acted like that as a culture, as a country,
as a world.
The world, for hundreds and hundreds of years, for sure, since since colonialization, started sending ships around the world to take over the resources and the people of other nations and other cultures and other religions as well, but also that on a micro level, that even though we think that we've healed from those times, that the leftovers, what they call the comorbid symptoms, the collateral damage of that, is that we are part of those, that biblical 7 generations, the sins of my father, and that we are constantly having to atone for that. And that's an important thing to do right now. And part of that is the idea of well-being, is that the better that I become, the better that I make myself, is this idea that I empathize with what some people call your godness, and if I am a piece of God, then all of the other pieces are also equally, that I have to empathize with them. I can't just sympathize with them. And that means to cherish them as well, and that the wish for myself, the well-being of myself, the being well, is the same thing that I also cherish and pray for, and even demand, even protest for other people. Because until everybody matters, then nobody matters. And I think that that's a worldwide thing that we see. And I think that even in the last few years, we talk about Arab Spring and other giant movements where countries are being toppled over, that at the heart of those things were ethnic and religious disparities and things that affected the well-being of people. It was not just prejudice. That prejudice went down to whether or not those people were able to live or die or be fed or be paid the same wages. And we tend to look at those things as third world problems or problems in other countries. And we're now having to admit that we're no different, that our legacy for the last 400 years, since 1619, so 401 years, is the same. And that we need to get better.
The colonization of the United States originally most of the colonies were founded by religious leaders who were fleeing persecution in England
Yes.
and or Europe. And they came to the United States to be able to pursue their own religious beliefs in a freer confine. The problematic thing, particularly, again, going back to the original colonies, is that they became very prejudicial.
Yes.
Anybody who was not, was in that particular colony area who was not of that religion was wrong.
Yes.
And so they brought with them the very thing that they were trying to escape,
Yes.
the judgmental.
I
And
think that
one of the big parts of well-being is to recognize that I'm not here to judge anybody.
yes.
I am here to be and to center within myself. And if I do that, I can work through not only my own sense of well-being, but the sense of well-being that we need in the city, the state, the country, and the world.
Yeah.
But it all starts within, and it's not oh, me, look at me, I'm so great. It's not that at all. It's just that without that sense of well-being, that sense of centeredness, that connection to the spiritual values that the Fillmores and Ernest Holmes and Mary Baker Eddy and Alice Bailey all wrote about and taught about, without those principles, what have we got?
Yeah. I think that one of the things about, because we tend to rewrite history, I think that in
The
Mary
winners
Baker
write
Eddy's-
history.
Exactly. I think that when in Mary Baker Eddy's time and in the Fillmore's time, they have a memory of the early 1800s and what the country was like before the Civil War that was in people's minds and people's memories. And also that we already by then had started to rewrite history. You bring up the idea of the colonies, and we're taught in school that King George was evil and that the colonists were good. And one of the things we don't talk about is that King George married Princess Sophia Charlotte, and she was a mulatto, and she was also from a very prominent family of Spanish aristocrats that were black. And the danger of King George marrying her was that she came from a very famous aristocratic family in Europe that were abolitionists. They were against slavery. And so pictures of her marriage to King George circulated in the colonies, and they knew that the marriage of George to her family, a black family of former Muslims, which is what mulatto means, is that Portuguese family was spreading the wildfire of abolition of slavery. And King George would be one of the first kings to say that slavery as an institution needed to end. And so our founding fathers, we forget, George Washington owned slaves, and Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, Franklin owned slaves, even the very popular characters in the musical by
Hamilton.
That he also was not just a slave owner, but a slave seller. And so the legacy of the victors rewriting histories is part of what our self-reflection is right now. And I think that we're not doing a revisionist history. I think we're doing it's like an inventory of what was real, all the great things of being this country, but also
A
all
course
of the ills.
correction.
Yeah, I think that kind of like, what our talk was going to be about was really about ourselves, and really we need to talk about everybody. And I think that going at it from a place understanding our history and understanding the cycles and understanding the pendulum swing of what you were talking about, that we've taken 2 steps forward and then we take 1 step backwards. And I think that right now, as hopefully we get to the apex of not only, what's going on pandemically, but also what's going on spiritually and emotionally and politically and historically, that this historic moment that we're experiencing doesn't swing us back, but swings us into something entirely new, entirely different.
Helps us move forward.
Yeah. And that's, to me, the definition of well-being is not just a physical thing, but it's an overall thing that what I do for myself is a tiny little metaphor of what I wish for the entire world, for the entire country.
I understand that concept, and we're constantly adjusting. I had a physical collapse almost 18 years ago,
Yes.
and I wasn't supposed to be as mobile as I am, but I had this sense of self and the sense of well-being. All is well in spite of appearance. And we need to extend that beyond ourselves into our relationships with other people.
Yes.
This sense of well-being and a calmness, a non-judgmental sense of self, where I can meet you where you are without being threatened by it.
Yeah, I think that's as good a definition of well-being or being well as there is. And I think those two things are different. One is like a noun and the other is like a verb. I think that the idea of well, Mrs. Fillmore, basically was not saying I want this thing. She was saying I am this thing, and therefore I do not inherit sickness. I do not accept what,
I am a child of God.
At the time was, yeah. And I think that when she said that, she began a process, an evolution over the next 10 years of understanding that what she had been taught as a child, what we all still are being taught, was not true in the sense of what Hindus believe and what Buddhists believe and what Muslims believe, and that there's a sense in the whole world that we are all part of something universal, part of a source.
Ted, she was a very sensible lady. She didn't cook. She put her dishes in the oven. She was not a cook at all. She used the stove for storage. That's true. And, Ted, having talked about this now for the last half hour, would you like to please lead us in a meditation?
I certainly would. So if I could ask everybody here and live and there and in your homes, if you would close your eyes for just a second, take a very, very deep breath. And I want you to imagine that you are breathing in all of the last half hour of what we've been talking about. And not just what we said or what we believe, but also what's behind it. Not what we say, but what it means to you. What are the pieces that you can glean out of what we were talking about? And how do we go into our own history, the history of our own races, of our own people, of our own politics, of our own growing up, and of our own ancestors, and what our first ancestors, what our parents taught us, and breathe that all in, and believe and hope and feel and wish, because that's where the word well comes from, is that we can imagine that we are breathing in not just what we were told to today, in our past, in our lives, in our histories, but what we envision, what the world looks like. You know, the word well and the noun well, you know, where we gather our water from, are two different words. But those two words in the English language after the Roman occupation came together to mean the same thing. And we still wish at a wishing well, that we draw from a source, but it does not just spring out of the well. We must physically do something to make the water come to us, that our well-being, the idea that the font or source or God or whatever we are, that we draw that to us. And also that once we have drawn it to us, that water is not just for us. The air that we're breathing in is not just for us. The land that we are on does not belong to us. It is not just for us. That we take this moment, that we take these last few months, that we take this period of self-reflection and this period of social distancing to wish what it would be like if we were all back together again. Not like 3 months ago or 4 months ago, but maybe at some unknown time when we were all able to communicate with our hearts, when we were all able to be together, to wish together, to pray together, and that the step backwards that we may have taken in the last 400 years even, that we wish to take 2 steps forward again. And we will fail, and we will fall, but we can never ever go back. And so as we exhale, as we move out, as we go out into the world again, and as we hopefully see each other and appreciate each other and feel each other differently, that being well and that the well-being of others is at the forefront of what we wish for ourselves, because I am another you. Namaste. I love all of you, miss all of you, and we'll see you in person soon.
Namaste to you, Ted, and hopefully a month from now, the first week in July, we're supposed to be being live, and I will see you live then, because I'll be here.
I look forward to that. All
Yes,
right.
I'm looking forward to it. And by the way, Ted, I think it's worth letting people know you and I have talked, and you have agreed to continue as our first Sunday speaker through 2021, and we're very grateful for that commitment from you. We love you and we honor you. Namaste to you, my friend.
Namaste. And save a donut for me.
Absolutely.